My name is Deb Van Dynen. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I'm the Director of the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs. The NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs are Hope College programs in partnership with many area libraries, businesses, institutions, and organizations. The purpose of the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs is for people to come together around a story. However, it's not just coming together and reading the same story. We really want people to use the book and its topics and themes as a springboard to listen and learn from each other, to learn more about our community and the world at large. Come join us this year as together we read An American Sunrise, a book of poems by Joy Harjo. For our Little Read program, we invite you to read Fry Bread, a Native American family story by Kevin Millard. Please visit our website, bigreadlakeshore.com, to find out more about our events, our programs, our guiding questions, and more about who we are and what we do along the lakeshore.
Welcome to this introductory session for the Fall 2021 Big Read at Hope College. The title is, For as Long as the Sun Shines, the Grass Grows and the River Flows. This is from a treaty that was made with Native Americans in the 19th century or the 20th century that symbolizes so many of the promises made to Native Americans that were routinely broken. Let's start here. In 1872, a painting was released to the public, and in the same year, you see this example of the map of the United States from 1868 to 1876. A lot of territories there in 1876, but America was just about finished its expansion westward. And in that time period from 1868 to 1876, a painting entitled American Progress in 1872 by the American painter John Gast showed his view, and quite honestly many people's view, of what the progress or the growth of the United States had been like from the time of the founding of the country as colonies, then into the American Revolution, then into the early Republic from 1790 to 1826, then into the War of 1812, finally a westward movement, what was called Manifest Destiny. And that's the key operative phrase right there, Manifest Destiny. It was believed in the 19th century that it was the destiny of America, the destiny of people that had come to America, that God had designed it, that God had foreordained it, that this country, this land, that many people consider to be virgin territory, fertile territory, unclaimed territory, uninhabited territory, was there for them to come and settle and build into a new civilization, or as John Winthrop would have put it, a city on a hill. The problem with that interpretation, though, is that the land was inhabited. There already were civilizations on this land, and there were many people who considered the land theirs, and they had a different way of viewing the land. You can see from the picture that there is a young woman floating above everybody that's moving west. And fleeing before this woman is called Progress. She's carrying in her hand a wire and a book. That book could be the Bible or the book of knowledge. If it's the Bible, it's a book of knowledge, or it could just be a book of intellectual knowledge. But that wire is a telegraph wire. And as she moves forward across the land, she's bringing with her literacy, she's bringing with her technology, and you notice that everywhere she's gone behind her, there's been a light, a nice warm light and glow, a civilization. Coming behind her is a stagecoach. Coming behind her are the railroads. Further east, you see rivers that have steamboats on them, in cities and towns. It would appear that everywhere she goes, it's a good result that she leaves behind. She's bringing the light of glory, the light of civilization, the light of knowledge, the light of advancement, the light of progress, the light of prosperity, the light of civilization. However, what you see going before her are Native Americans. Not only are they running from her, which implies that they're fleeing from civilization, they're fleeing from progress, they're fleeing from knowledge, they're fleeing from faith, they're fleeing from the light, they're running from the light, and literally running into the darkness. The messages in this picture are so multiple, and they are so poisonous, and they exemplify the story that Americans told themselves about the relationship of colonists, settlers, Americans to Native Americans from the time that Europeans had set out across the Atlantic Ocean to come to North America. This map of the Atlantic world shows the juxtaposition of North America to the eastern coast of Europe and East Africa, or rather West Africa. But we need to understand that long before Europeans got to North America, long before Columbus came across the ocean in 1492, there were thriving, expansive Native American civilizations, not just in North America, but also in Central and South America. One of them was the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire, as exemplified by this map right here, you see the Aztecs in the purple, and the Mayans in the green, and the Aztecs in the purple. Aztec civilization and Maya civilization, and what is currently today Mesoamerica, Central America. Look at how much land those two civilizations, those two people covered. And then the Inca Empire, further south, along the west coast of South America, took up vast amounts of territory in the Andean highlands. And again, these were thriving civilizations that had number systems, they had writing systems, they were literate, they studied the stars, they waged wars of conquest, they had diversified economies. And then, if you just take a look at this map of the many different groups of people that inhabited North America. Because just like Europeans call themselves Danish and Swedish and German and French and Portuguese and Spanish and Russian, likewise, Native Americans, not all Native Americans were the same. Different tribes, different ethnic groups, and sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they warred against each other. All together, though, they inhabited North America. And even in Michigan, in our beloved state of Michigan, there were the people of what was called the Three Fires, or the Three Fires Council, the Ottawa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, which made up the largest people groups, some of the larger people groups that were inhabiting Michigan and the Upper Peninsula by the time settlers arrived in what became the Michigan Territory. But it didn't take long for trouble ahead to manifest itself in the relationship between European settlers and the Native American inhabitants of North America. One instance that occurred was in the Chesapeake colonies of 1670, the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia in 1675. In 1675, particularly in the colony of Virginia, a young ne'er-do-well named Nathaniel Bacon wanted land. Now, he wasn't poor, but he also wasn't very wealthy. He was a prominent individual in the colony of Virginia, and the royal governor of Virginia, because keep in mind at this time, Virginia was owned by the British as a colony. Nathaniel Bacon wanted that land, and there were other people who wanted land as well, particularly people who were indentured servants. The indentured servitude could last from 5 years to 7 years, sometimes 9 years, or depending upon how well an indentured servant did or didn't do their work, could go on for maybe as many years as their owner, so to speak, would add on to their years of indenture. The point was, though, that these people agreed to work for someone, to work off their passage from, when they booked passage from Europe to the United States, and at the time that their indenture was up, they would then go out and make their own way in the frontier. But we need to keep in mind, and I do not want to get away from this point at all, that frontier had on it people, Native American peoples who were living there, hunted there, going to school there. They were living there, doing all the things that people do when they're trying to just go through their day and raise their families. But Nathaniel Bacon wanted that land, and Governor Berkeley was a corrupt governor. He was giving that land, large tracts of it, hundreds of acres, sometimes more than that, to his cronies and friends in the colonies and back in England. Well, Nathaniel Bacon knew that the governor was corrupt, so he decided to challenge the governor on his practices, because the governor, in addition to giving the land away to his cronies, he was working with Native Americans saying, look, don't worry about it. We'll keep the settlers off your land. But Nathaniel Bacon and the people who wanted that land thought that was unfair. So they staged their revolt, which scared Governor Berkeley. And by the time it was over, Nathaniel Bacon had managed to get Governor Berkeley to break his agreement with the Native Americans, and the indentures and Nathaniel Bacon went out there and took that land. And of course, indentured servants, once they get free and can get out there on their own and start working the land, they're not interested in working the land like they had to when they were owned. They wanted someone else to work the land. Now, Native Americans knew the land. They were familiar with the territory, the terrain, and the topography, so they either would resist or they would flee deep into the interior. That left one choice. Because in 1675, there was another population that was becoming more numerous in North America, black slaves or slaves of African descent, free people who had been reduced to slavery. So you had now people that have access to land. The people that own the land don't want to work it. They put slaves to work on that land. So in addition to driving Native Americans further west, the Bacon's Rebellion of 1675 also had the result of setting up a system that spread slavery. And like so many other encounters, this was a violent clash, not just between civilizations, but between people with differing values and differing means of accomplishing their ends. And the final result, which would establish another reference point, another data point that will become very difficult for the United States as we move further into its history, slavery spread. In 1756, the battle for North America, the battle for North America, meaning Canada and what became the United States, took a turn for the worse. In 1756, the British and the French, who had been continental competitors for a long, long time anyway, they ended up going to war in what became what's called the Great War for Empire, or the 7 Years' War, because, well, it lasted 7 years. The North American component of that war was called the French and Indian War. The French had territorial claims in North America, Canada, in Central America, central, what became the United States, down to New Orleans, along the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley. And so the British and their Native American allies, and the French and their Native American allies fought to see who would have control of North America. And let me tell you, it was a fight, and it was warfare as bad, as traumatic, and as destabilizing as any kind of warfare has ever been. For 7 years, the British and the French fought each other in Europe, they fought each other in South America, they fought each other in the Caribbean, they fought each other on the Atlantic Ocean, they fought each other in the Mediterranean, in North Africa and Southern Europe. It was a global conflict, and also in North America. The North American component, as I mentioned, was the French and Indian War. Well, it couldn't last much longer. And by the time you get to 1763, the British had achieved for themselves victory. And with that victory in the 7 Years' War, the British became the dominant European power in North America, Canada, and what became the future United States. But victory for the British had consequences. You see, because in addition to winning the victory, you have now a bunch of disgruntled Native American groups, and of course disgruntled Frenchmen who have lost that war. They're not too numerous to threaten the British, really, but because already American settlers were moving across the Appalachian mountain chain, going further west, irritating Native Americans, taking their land, trespassing on their territory, trespassing their sacred barrier areas, the British made an agreement with the Native Americans to draw a line that was called the Proclamation of 1763, a line that went from present-day Maine down to present-day Georgia. Think of the Appalachian Trail, about 2,000 miles. And the British agreed to build a series of forts to patrol and police that line. And the whole goal was to keep British colonial settlers, American colonists, on the eastern side of that range. And as you can see from that picture right there, the Indian Reserve was supposed to be set aside for the Native Americans. The irony with this is that before Europeans, there had been no such thing as, and no need for, something called an Indian Reserve. As long as the line would hold, things presumably would be okay. Well, the British, of course, said that they promised to patrol the line and keep the settlers on the eastern side of that mountain range. It absolutely did not work. Think of any kind of metaphor you want, a bag with holes in it, a balloon that's got all kind of holes puncturing it. The British was simply impossible to patrol 2,000 miles of mountainous territory from Maine to Georgia, from future Maine to Georgia. And not to mention that, it was expensive. 7 years of global warfare with France on the high seas in different continents had drained the British economy and put an entire strain on the British nation. Now the British, having troops stationed in North America on a permanent basis to patrol the Proclamation Line in 1763, had to find a way of funding this activity, because strange thing about soldiers, they expect to get paid. Not to mention, it costs money to house soldiers, to put them in uniform, to supply them with weapons, arms, food, whatever soldiers need to do the job that they need to do. So the British came up with an idea. And it was an idea that definitely caused storm clouds to form on the horizon. The Proclamation Line in 1763 set up a series of events that eventually produced a conflict between Britain's colonial subjects and the Crown of England. To offset the cost, to defray the cost of keeping troops in North America, to help offset the cost of what it had taken for 7 years of warfare around the world, the British decided in 1765 to pass something called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765. Now, there were many other pieces of legislation that would follow this one, but this was the one, more than anything, that historians identify as being that moment when the British passed a piece of legislation, and they passed it in the English Parliament. They didn't ask for anybody's permission inside the United States or in future United States or in their colonies. They did it because the British believed it was all one unitary empire. So they passed it, and the reaction for many Americans was one of profound negativity. Americans saw this as an encroachment upon their civil rights, upon their freedom, and what became a movement for separating from Great Britain. The phrase was that eventually you start getting to the 1770s was no taxation without representation. If you take my money, I expect to have a voice in government. No more of this business where some parliamentarian 1,000 miles away is passing legislation that hits my pocketbook. The Americans want a direct representation in the parliament. How can you possibly speak for me in my community if you don't know what's going on in my community and what's going on in my life from thousands of miles away? The two points of view grew further and further apart until 1775, when shooting opened up at Lexington and Concord, launching the shooting phase of what had been a war of words that generally became known as the American Revolution. From 1775 to 1771, Native Americans found themselves between the American colonists and the Royal Crown. The British had their Native American allies, and so did the Americans. But either way, this was a contest that Native Americans were not going to benefit from, because no matter what happened, if the British lost, if the British won, they now have an ally who could not hold up their end of the bargain before. If the Americans won, it was a guarantee that they were going to go further west and continue violating Native American territory. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson, was made public to the American patriots. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and we now know women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the aspirational value of the Declaration of Independence. And it further helped give momentum and purpose and cohesion to that thing that was called the American Revolution, especially the one being fought on the battlefield. In 1781, the Americans scored a major victory in a place in Virginia called Yorktown, which pretty much did end the British military effort in North America, trying to hold on to their colonies. Final peace, though, was set by a peace treaty between the British and the Americans in 1783, formally ending the shooting phase of the American Revolution. So America became an independent nation. But there were some things about the young nation that were very troubling, not to mention its staggering debt, its vulnerability, and the fact that the British were still in a position to collect that debt, and it was not too much of an impossibility that the British, in desiring to collect that debt, would pay the Americans a visit and take it by force. So what happened in the early days of the Republic was that there was a lot of taxation, well, frankly, without representation. And many people felt, well, this happened to the British, it's happening now under American leaders, what's different aside from the people doing the taxing? There was a rebellion in Massachusetts that so scared people in the colonists that they decided that the document up under which the nation was being governed at that point, the Articles of Confederation, needed a serious revision. So they gathered in Philadelphia, the word was put out for a meeting to be held in Annapolis that year, 1787. No one showed up. So they rescheduled it, and in the spring and summer of 1787, they gathered in Philadelphia to look over the Articles of Confederation to see what they could do to revise them. As it turned out, the articles were deemed to be wholly insufficient for the kind of central, strong government that a new American nation needed, so they began writing in secret a document that we now know of as the Constitution. In that same year, though, you still have something called the Confederation Congress, the Congress that had formed under the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777. In that Confederation Congress in 1787, the same year as the Constitutional Convention, they passed something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what that Northwest Ordinance did was it carved out a huge swath of territory, what today we call the Upper Midwest, that set aside land for future settlement. This was land upon which Native Americans were already living, farming, hunting, living, conducting their lives and their affairs. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 gave a number of guidelines and criteria about what a territory had to do if it was going to apply for membership as a state in the future United States. They had to prohibit slavery. They gave a minimum number of white males that had to own property. They had civil liberties in mind: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It was, if you will, an early dry run at some of the same kind of language that would be included in the Constitution. Out of the Northwest Territory would come the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and to some extent, Minnesota. It also included the 5 Great Lakes. We're talking about a tremendous amount of land and a tremendous quantity of the bodies of water. 5 Great Lakes and a number of different states. At the Constitutional Convention, there was a great deal of acrimony and debate over how the new nation was going to be formed. The document was finally passed. The preamble said, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It's wonderful language. It's great language. It's some of the best political philosophy of the late 18th century. However, we have to wait, stop, and ask ourselves a question about that preamble. Because in 1787, the question that must be asked is, in 1787, who was included in we? In 1787, we did not include women. In 1787, we did not include poor white men. In 1787, we absolutely did not include black slaves. In 1787, we absolutely did not include Native Americans. In fact, just to show you how much Native Americans were not going to be included in the larger fabric of the constitutional framework, we take a look at how and why this came to be the way it was. It was a devil's bargain that was made in the language of the Constitution itself. Primarily, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, which became known as the 3/5 Compromise, where black people, with the stroke of a pen, were reduced to 3/5 of a person. Article 1, Section 9, the Migration Importation Clause, which pretty much guaranteed that the American nation would become involved in the slave trade, formally. And Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. While all those which are referred to as the pro-slavery clauses of the 1787 Constitution, it's in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 that the fate for Native Americans was spelled out. And if you read it fast enough, you can almost trip right over it, or just blow right past it. One of the big debates in the Constitutional Convention was, what kind of government shall we have? Shall it be a unicameral house or a bicameral house? It was decided we're going to have a bicameral house. There'll be a lower chamber called the House of Representatives, where the representatives there will be based on population, and the upper house, to offset the disadvantages in the lower house, where some states like New York, that had a big population already, would always have more representatives than states like Connecticut. So how is a state like Connecticut supposed to get a fair shake if they're going to be outnumbered by representatives every time? That solution was said, in the Senate, every state, no matter what their size, gets 2 senators. And bills will be formed in the House, will be written in the House first, then they'll be kicked upstairs to the Senate, where people were supposed to be older, wiser, more settled in their ways, will consider the bill, and then if they decide to pass it, they'll send it on to the chief executive, the president, for signing and then being passed into law. But still the question was, if the House of Representatives is going to be a House of Representation, how do you get the numbers to determine those representatives? Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 said the following: representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned, that is, they shall be divided up among the several states, which may be included within this union. And we need to take note of the fact that when the founders wrote, which may be included within this union, they were already looking ahead and kind of foreshadowing, telegraphing that there are other states are going to be included within this union, which may be included. Is a guarantee that other states are going to be coming in. People are moving west right now, and we're making accommodations for them bringing other territory, other states into this union. We're going to get that number of representation by considering their respective numbers, which shall be determined by, track with me here now, adding the whole number of free persons plus those bound to service for a term of years. So yes, in 1787, there was still a system called indentured servitude. We're going to take the whole number of free persons plus indentured service minus Indians not taxed and 3/5 of all other persons. If the rallying cry of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation, in other words, if you take my money, I expect to have a voice in government. If Indians are not taxed, then the conclusion must be that they won't have a voice in government either. We should not be surprised that Native Americans will spend the next century or more being kicked across the continent. A group of people that have no voice in government, no representation in government, just a group of people to be moved around, shoved around, and disposed of at the government's whim and fancy. Truly, there are dark days and dark clouds ahead for Native Americans. In 1811, there was an attempt to resist, though. I don't want to give the impression that Native Americans didn't fight back, because they did. They used a variety of ways that people who were under siege always use. Some of them tried to accommodate, some tried to assimilate. Thomas Jefferson, who was elected president in 1800, his whole idea for solving what he called the Native American problem was just have them assimilate into the larger cultural society. Have them become farmers. That way they could be like everybody else. The truth of the matter was that they were never going to be accepted by anybody else. And by 1811, the situation had gotten so dire that a resistance leader named Tecumseh, born in 1768 and 1813, a Shawnee chief, he decided, like Pontiac did in 1763, to try and get differing Native American groups to come together and form a confederation. In other words, a wall of resistance, so we could just cooperate and stop these settlers from coming into our territory. Instead of us each looking out for our own individual self-interest, let's come together and unite and form a common barrier of resistance. Well, Tecumseh had an opponent in the governor of Indiana at the time, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison, who will end up being the 9th president of the United States, governor of Illinois. He was also a military man. Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison and their backers met in Indiana in November 1811. While Tecumseh was off trying to rally other supporters to his cause, William Henry Harrison staged an attack in Indiana, a place called Tippecanoe, the Battle of Tippecanoe, which overwhelmed the Native American forces there. And it cleared the way for more settlement and expansion. By 1819, the country has expanded to and beyond the Mississippi River, and that huge swath of territory you see in this map, the Missouri Territory. In 1819, the territory of Missouri applied for admission to the Union. And the question that confronted the people that wanted to come into the Union for the territory of Missouri, the big question for the country, the big question for the Senate was this: would it come in as a slave or a free state? Because depending upon how you answer that question, either the South or the North would get 2 more senators to their advantage. In 1819, the split in the country of northern and southern states was 11 to 11. 11 northern, 11 southern. So the balance in the Senate was sitting very, very close, hair thin. And if Missouri came in, that would be 12 to 11. The North would be at a 2-vote disadvantage. A great debate broke out in the Senate over the fate of Missouri coming in as a slave state or a free state. And because of that debate, what it did was it elevated the cause of slavery for the first time in national consciousness, slavery as an issue of culture, society, and politics became more than just an annoyance. It became this issue that could possibly tear the country apart, and people began fearing a thing called civil war. Now, as it turned out, Missouri came into the Union as a slave state because at the last minute, the territory of Maine applied for admission to the Union as a free state. And the compromise was this: Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state. The balance in the Senate will now be 12 per section. And the other part of the compromise was that Missouri would have, as a boundary containing slavery in the South, slavery would be confined by congressional legislation and agreement to below the 36-degree, 30-minute east-west line. So now, for political geography, you have slavery, which is being confined to the southern part of the country. And what that meant, think about this. Look at how far west Missouri is. That meant that slavery had pushed that far west, and every time slavery moved further west, Native Americans were driven right before it. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, had a nickname among Native Americans. They called him Old Shark Knife. He absolutely detested, despised Native Americans. In 1830, Jackson signed into law something called the Indian Removal Act. I don't know how much more obvious, blatant, in your face you can be about the intent of a piece of legislation. Now, there were people who opposed this, who saw this for what it was, a gigantic land grab. But the bill went through. Andrew Jackson, in his December 6, 1830 message to Congress, annual message to Congress, said, it gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching a happy consummation. Let me revisit that. By his own words, Andrew Jackson is saying the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. Two important tribes have accepted the provision which made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it's believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages. If you're not looking hard enough, this sounds like it might be a pretty good deal for the Native Americans, except it absolutely was anything but that. This map right here shows that the forced removal of Native Americans from their lands in Georgia, parts of North Carolina, parts of Alabama, the Cherokee specifically. The Cherokee symbolized the attempt of a group of Native Americans who did their absolute best to try to fit in with larger society. They did become farmers. A number of them even became slaveholders. They tried so hard. And yet, at the end of the day, they still were forcibly removed from their land by the U.S. Army. Their journey from their eastern lands to what became the future state of Oklahoma was known as the Trail of Tears. Along the Trail of Tears, and there are historical markers where for those who choose to, they can go and visit them and walk parts of the Trail of Tears. It's estimated that between 2,000 and 4,000 or 5,000 Native Americans perished along that trail. Yes, this happened in the United States. The U.S. Army driving people before them, moving them from their land to a territory where they had never been before, to an environment, to terrain that they were not familiar with, because they needed that land for settlement and to expand the wicked system of slavery. The last phase of America's expansion in the 19th century that will complete the acquisition of territory for the states that make up the lower 48 happened from 1846 to 1848, the Mexican-American War. It was another blatant land grab. We don't have time to go into all the causes of the Mexican-American War, but let's just say that not only was it an engineered conflict, but for the first time, the American military, now being run by graduates from West Point, showed the world what it had and what it was made of. The Mexican army was a professional army, and it was a potent enemy. However, the excellence of American command and control and leadership, and the daring boldness of General Winfield Scott, who used a combination of amphibious and land movements, a combination of those coordinated together, and the telegraph, which was a new piece of technology that allowed fast communications, invented in 1844, the first message sent by Samuel F.B. Morse, which was, "What hast thou wrought?" The technology, railroads, and the combination of amphibious and land operations made the American onslaught in the Mexican-American War something which was unstoppable. And by the end, the map showed that America had gotten for itself all this territory with Native Americans on it. That was open for settlement, open for territorial organization, and eventually open for states applying to the Union. And we need to remember that there were still people on this land who called this home. The issue, though, became one of slavery versus freedom. Just as in the case of Missouri, the question always was, when a state applied for admission to the Union, what would it come in as? A free state or a slave state? In the case of California, very often, the debates tended to tilt toward people talking about secession, so acrimonious were the debates. But time after time, in the contest of slavery versus freedom, slavery was the winner, all too often. And because of that, because the country could not resolve its differences over the sections north and south on whether or not human beings have the right by law, by cosmic edict, cosmic nod, to own, buy, sell, and dispose of other human beings as they saw fit. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on the U.S. federal fort at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And the Civil War was underway. The Civil War was a bloody conflict. It was a traumatizing conflict. It tied up American men, women, children for 4 years, from April 12, 1861 until April 9, 1865. It took nearly 1 million American lives. It produced all of the horrible things that war produces: refugees, trauma, wounds, death, dislocation, destabilization, diseases, collapsing economies. It was a horrible, horrible conflict, but it finally did end. And at its end, slavery had been declared unconstitutional by the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment was passed, which would, at least for a moment, give a glimmer of hope to African Americans and other people that civil liberties would be more than just a thing that people gave lip service to, but actually were serious about achieving and granting. From 1865 to 1877, the nation tried to heal its wounds during a period called Reconstruction. But it's in that period of 1865 to 1877, Reconstruction, when the struggle that Native Americans were engaged in to hang on to their way of life, hang on to their independence, hang on to their freedom, took another turn, another form of resistance, and the struggle was real. And that struggle on this occasion was led by a very powerful, wise, and courageous Native American leader named Tatanka Iotonka, known as Sitting Bull, born 1831 and died in 1890. He had a confrontation with a general from Michigan, George Armstrong Custer from Monroe, Michigan, who had made quite a name for himself as a dashing, flamboyant, very successful leader during the Civil War. These two men would meet on the field of battle at a place called Little Bighorn on June 25th, 1876, and it was absolute mayhem. It was a rare moment in the history of Native Americans in trying to hold on to their land, freedom, independence, and way of life, that for a moment, just for an all too brief moment, the scales of fate would tilt in their favor. George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry were wiped out. And at the National Little Bighorn National Monument, there are markers there for the brave U.S. soldiers who fell that day, but also, fittingly, for the brave Native Americans who fell that day, such as this one from Manto Haton, Bear with Horns, and these two right here. The Native American struggle to hang on to their land, to hang on to their way of life, to maintain their independence, to maintain their respect, their ways, their culture, their language, that lasted for hundreds, thousands of years, was coming to an end or going into a new phase. But for the 19th century, the summation was so eloquently and tragically and tragic and beautiful in its tragedy, summed up in the last words spoken by this individual here. His name was Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph got the message. You don't want us here. You don't want us here, and quite frankly, we don't want to be here anymore. He was leading his group of Native Americans, of the Nez Perce Indians, trying to go through the Pacific Northwest to get into Canada. The U.S. Army had been pursuing them. There had been clashes, there had been confrontations. And then finally, a day came when not allowed to escape into Canada. And Chief Joseph must have been thinking to himself, let me get this straight. You don't want us here, right? No, we don't want you here. We're trying to leave. We didn't say you could leave. Well, why don't you let us leave? Because we didn't tell you you could go. Chief Joseph, between that proverbial rock and a hard place, on October 5th, 1877, spoke some of the most haunting words of this multi-century struggle between Native Americans and people, interlopers, taking their land. He said, I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed, Looking Glass is dead. Tuhulhuset is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say no and yes. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are. Perhaps they are freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. And then he said this, hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sad and sick. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. All along, from the very beginning, all Native Americans wanted were people who would deal with them in truth, deal with them as equals and show them respect, deal with them in fairness, deal with them with justice. And it may be that things are turning around, a glimmer of hope. We have now, as Secretary of the Interior, the Honorable Deborah Haaland, a Native American who, for the first time, she's in the cabinet of President Joseph R. Biden. And as Secretary of the Interior, you couldn't find a more fitting and yet historically ironic position for her to be in. She's the one who now gets to decide what happens to Native American lands and lands across the United States. So maybe there is cause for us to have a brighter view of the future. Maybe. But just as that one treaty said, for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows, it may be that a time will come. It may be that a time has come when those words will actually can be believed, and more importantly, that those words will be honored. That's what gives us our hope. Thank you for taking time to listen.